exhaust manifold. I should say I was 3 hours out of Harbor Grace.
Where did you actually make your landing, Miss Earhart?
On the last lap of her magnificent flight round the world by way of the equator, Miss Amelia Earhart was lost in...
I cruised inland until I found a suitable pasture. I landed there after frightening all the cows in the neighborhood and rolled up to the farmer's front.
Radio operators heard desperate messages, then water sounds, then silence. The Navy searched 200 and...
How far out were you when you first had the engine trouble?
It wasn't exactly engine trouble. It was the exhaust only.
And 50,000 square miles of ocean and found nothing. They said she crashed and sank, but hidden in government files were reports of signals coming from one tiny island. Scientists just decoded those transmissions using new technology. They traced every signal to the same spot. Here's the final answer about what happened to Amelia Earhart, and why officials twisted the story. Amelia Earhart's story didn't begin with airplanes. It began in the quiet town of Akeson, Kansas, in 1897, where she was born into a family that swung between wealth and chaos. Her father, Edwin, worked as a railroad lawyer but struggled with alcoholism. That meant the family never stayed in one place for long. Her mother, Amy, came from a rich background and had no interest in raising her daughters the proper way. She refused to force Amelia into traditional roles. One day Amelia might be riding in a horse-drawn carriage at her grandparents' mansion. The next she'd be trying to ignore her father's public outbursts. That mix of privilege and instability gave her grit. Even before she turned 10, Amelia had already learned how to keep moving forward no matter what. She wasn't like the other girls. While they played with dolls, Amelia was outside climbing trees, building sled ramps, and shooting rats with a .22 rifle. Her grandmother even built her a custom ramp for her sled. It was fast, wild, and dangerous, exactly how Amelia liked it. One day she took some planks, a crate, and built a homemade roller coaster. It crashed, she bruised herself, and she didn't care. She just shouted, "It's just like flying!" That wild streak wasn't a phase, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Her family kept moving and so did she. Between 1913 and 1916, Amelia attended 6 different high schools in 4 years. She went from Kansas City to Chicago, never staying long, always adjusting. Most kids would have crumbled, but Amelia learned to adapt fast, make friends easily, and handle new places with confidence. Each new school was a challenge, but instead of being afraid of change, she started to crave it. By the time she graduated from Hyde Park High School in 1916, she wasn't just curious about the world, she was ready to explore it. Then came World War I. Amelia was 20 when she made a bold decision. She dropped out of the Oyen School in Pennsylvania, where she was being trained to be a refined lady, and went to Toronto to work in a military hospital. She became a nurse's aide at Spadina Hospital, doing 12-hour shifts caring for wounded soldiers and Spanish flu victims. It was hard, the injuries were brutal, the illness was deadly, but she didn't flinch. Most women in her position wouldn't have done it, but Amelia wasn't most women. She wanted to be useful. She saw bravery every day in the faces of the soldiers, in the pilots who flew into battle. That spirit stuck with her. Everything changed in December 1920. Amelia went to an air show in Long Beach, California. A pilot named Frank Hawks offered her a short ride in a biplane. Her father paid $10 for the 10-minute flight, an expensive thrill at the time. But once they were in the air, something clicked. The plane climbed to 300 feet and Amelia felt something she'd never felt before: freedom. She knew instantly that she had to fly. Nothing else mattered. In just 6 months, she saved $1,000 for flying lessons, an enormous amount for a woman in 1921. She worked tough jobs, drove a gravel truck, worked in a photo studio, answered phones. Every penny went toward lessons with a woman named Nita Snook. Nita was just 24 and had barely 2 years of flying experience, but in those days, that made her a veteran. Planes were dangerous. There were no safety features, the cockpits were open, the engines often failed. 1 in 6 pilots died in crashes. Nita herself had survived a crash by landing in a haystack. Amelia didn't care. She was hooked. She proved herself fast. On October 22, 1922, less than 2 years after her first flight, Amelia flew solo to an altitude of 14,000 feet. No woman had done it before. She did it in a yellow Kinner Airs she called the Canary. The plane had just 60 horsepower and could barely reach 85 miles per hour. It wasn't built for high altitudes. There was no oxygen supply and the cockpit was wide open. It was 20 degrees up there. Her engine started sputtering. She could have turned back, but she didn't. She pushed forward, risking her life for a record. When she landed after nearly 3 hours, she was so cold that people had to help lift her from the cockpit. She wasn't just daring, she was determined. On May 16, 1923, at just 26 years old, Amelia became the 16th woman in the world to earn an international pilot's license. It wasn't just paperwork. She had to pass difficult exams on navigation, mechanics, weather, and law. She had to fly in front of strict European inspectors who didn't trust American women pilots. She nailed it. At a time when there were fewer than 200 licensed female pilots in the world. Amelia joined an elite group, and she did it faster than many men who had years more experience. In June 1928, Amelia Earhart made headlines across the world. She had just crossed the Atlantic Ocean by air, becoming the first woman ever to do it. But there was a catch: she didn't fly the plane. She sat in the back of the Friendship, a Fokker aircraft piloted by Wilmer Stultz and Lewis Gordon. The trip lasted 20 hours and 40 minutes. They left from Trepassey Harbour in Newfoundland and landed in Bury Port, Wales. When they landed, crowds cheered. There were celebrations in New York, a parade, a visit to the White House. But Amelia knew the truth: she never touched the controls. She even told reporters, "Stultz did all the flying. I had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes." She smiled for the cameras, but deep down it didn't feel right. Everyone saw her as a hero, but she hadn't earned it yet, not in her eyes. That feeling would stay with her until 1932, when she finally flew solo across the Atlantic. That 1928 flight had been planned down to the smallest detail, but it wasn't Amelia's plan. It all started with Amy Phipps Guest, a rich woman who wanted to be the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic. When her family talked her out of it, she decided to fund the trip anyway, just with someone else. She needed a woman with the right look and the right image. Enter George Palmer Putnam. He was a big-time publisher who had just made a fortune helping Charles Lindbergh sell his autobiography. Lindbergh had made $250,000 from it, and Putnam had sold over 650,000 copies. So when Guest needed someone to turn her idea into a public event, she called Putnam. He searched for the right woman and found Earhart. At the time, she was unknown, just another pilot, but she had the look, the charm, and a quiet confidence that drew people in. Their first meeting was strictly business, but things changed. They had a lot in common: hiking, swimming, camping, tennis, golf. Eventually, Earhart moved into Putnam's home so they could work on a book. He was still married, but his wife had left to travel with a younger man. By 1931, Amelia and Putnam were married. After the flight, Putnam went to work. He knew how to build a brand. He helped Amelia write a book called 20 Hours, 40 Minutes. It came out in 1928 and was a hit. But the book was only the beginning. Putnam set up lecture tours across the country. He got her endorsement deals for luggage, even for Lucky Strike cigarettes. That one didn't go over well. McCall's magazine pulled back from working with her because of it. Still, the fame kept growing. In October 1928, just months after the flight, Earhart became the first woman aviation editor for Cosmopolitan magazine. She wrote articles for magazines and newspapers, even National Geographic. Her second book, The Fun of It, came out in 1932 and helped make her the most famous female pilot in the world. But Amelia didn't just want to be famous, she wanted to help other women fly too. In 1929, after competing in the Women's Air Derby, she called together a group of women pilots. At the time, there were only 285 licensed female pilots in the entire U.S. 99 of them signed up. That's how the 99s began. It was more than a club, it was a support system for women in aviation, a field that was still run almost entirely by men. The 1929 Women's Air Derby was where Amelia really started showing how competitive she could be. The press mocked it with the name, Powder Puff Derby, but the race itself was no joke. It went from Santa Monica, California, to Cleveland, Ohio. There were stops in places like Phoenix, El Paso, Fort Worth, and St. Louis. It took place over 8 tough days in August. To even enter, pilots needed 100 hours of solo flight time and 25 hours of cross-country flying. They also needed 2 licenses, one from the U.S. Department of Commerce and another from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. 20 women entered. Only 14 finished. One pilot, Marvel Crossan, died in a crash. Ruth Nichols was injured in an accident and had to quit. Some women even accused others of sabotage. Earhart ran into trouble too. Her propeller was damaged early in the race. Officials held up the entire competition to let her repair it, a favor not given to other pilots like Pancho Barnes, who crashed later and got no such help. Still, Amelia pushed through. She finished 5th overall. Louise stayed and won the race with a time of 20 hours, 19 minutes, and 4 seconds. But Amelia had proven herself. She wasn't just a face for magazine covers anymore, she was a serious competitor. When she stepped out of the plane in Cincinnati and faced a crowd of 15,000 people, she told them straight. Women could fly just as well as men. On May 20, 1932, she took off from Newfoundland in her red Lockheed Vega and flew solo across the Atlantic. It took 14 hours and 56 minutes. She lost her altimeter, flew through fog, battled icing on the wings, and watched flames shoot from a cracked exhaust pipe. Her fuel gauge failed too, but she made it. She landed in Northern Ireland and became the first woman ever to fly solo nonstop across the Atlantic. She received the Distinguished Flying Cross, no woman before her had. Then in August, she pushed herself even harder. She flew solo across the entire U.S., from Los Angeles to Newark. That flight lasted nearly 19 hours. She flew through extreme heat, thin air, and storms. It was exhausting, but she set a speed record and proved her Atlantic flight wasn't just luck. Amelia Earhart had already broken records, won awards, and done almost everything a woman could do in aviation. But by 1936 she was restless. She wanted one last challenge, one that would push her beyond the limits. So she set her sights on something no one had done before: fly around the world. Not by the shortest route, but along the equator. It would be the longest circumnavigation ever attempted. She wasn't just chasing glory, she was all in. Earhart mortgaged her future for this dream. Purdue University supported her through a research fund, and she used that money to build a special plane, a Lockheed Electra 10E. It had extra fuel tanks for long flights and was tailored to her exact needs. Publicly, she denied having any such plan when the plane arrived, but behind closed doors, her husband George Putnam was already reaching out to Eleanor Roosevelt and the State Department to get help for the mission. Then came disaster. On March 17, 1937, Amelia and her crew took off from Oakland and made it to Honolulu, setting a new time record. But as they prepared for the second leg of the trip to Howland Island, everything fell apart. On March 20th, the Electra took off from Luke Field at 5:53 a.m. The weather was calm, but just seconds into the takeoff, the plane veered right, then left, violently swinging out of control. It looked like the right wheel took most of the pressure until it collapsed. Then the left one gave out too. The plane skidded on its belly, throwing sparks as it spun and slammed into the runway. The damage was massive: wings, rudder, engines, stabilizer, all wrecked. People debated what went wrong. Some said a tire burst. Others blamed the landing gear. Some even hinted at pilot error. But no one had a clear answer. That crash wasn't just a setback, it was a warning. But Earhart ignored it. And worse, she made a series of risky choices. When one of her crew members, Harry Manning, left after the accident, she was left with only Fred Noonan. Both had no training in Morse code. So Earhart removed the telegraph key altogether. She called it dead weight. She also ditched the trailing antenna that was vital for using the 500 kilo emergency frequency. Instead, she chose voice radio, but voice signals didn't reach as far over the Pacific. If something went wrong, she'd be isolated, and she knew Howland Island was nearly invisible from the sky, just 2 miles long and 1 mile wide. Losing communication meant losing any hope of finding it. Even Noonan wasn't the safest choice. He had a strong background, worked for Panama, knew celestial navigation, but he also had a serious drinking problem. Rumors followed him for years. A 1937 police report mentioned later in a book claimed he drank while on duty. Whether true or not, Earhart knew about his reputation. She even hinted at problems in a message to her husband, saying there were personnel unfitness issues and radio misunderstandings. Most believed she was talking about Noonan. Still, she decided to push forward. After fixing the Electra and rerouting the journey, she started again, this time from Oakland to Miami in May 1937. From there, she launched her final world flight on June 1st, first to Puerto Rico, then Africa, then India, then Southeast Asia. By June 17th, she flew non-stop from the Red Sea to Karachi, something no one had done before. It was bold, risky, and exhausting. But exhaustion started to catch up with her. In Bandung, she got dysentery and had to rest for days. Meanwhile, the plane needed repairs again. Still, she pressed on. By June 29th, she reached La, New Guinea. That was the last stop before the Pacific crossing, 2,556 miles to Howland Island. It would take over 18 hours. On July 2nd at 10 a.m., they took off from La. The Electra was full, around 1,100 gallons of fuel. That should have given them about 20 to 24 hours of flight time. But the heat in La thinned the fuel, reducing its effectiveness. They likely lost 30 minutes of air time before even lifting off. Then came the winds. A strong 26-mile headwind pushed against them the entire way. That turned their 2,556-mile journey into something closer to 3,100. That was cutting it way too close. Back near Howland Island, the Coast Guard ship Itasca was ready, but things went wrong again. In Miami, Earhart had removed her long-range antenna, so now she couldn't pick up ship signals on the 500 kHz band. Even worse, she gave the Itasca the wrong frequency, 7,500 kilocycles. Her plane's navigation gear couldn't take bearings on that high a frequency. The Itasca could hear her voice, but she couldn't hear them at all. At 7:42 a.m., they got one last clear message. "We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. Flying at 1,000 feet. Itasca kept broadcasting. Even San Francisco could hear them, but Earhart's radio never picked up a word. At 8:43 a.m., more than 20 hours after takeoff, her last transmission came. "We are on the line 157-337 running north and south." That meant they were flying back and forth along a navigational line, trying to spot Howland Island. They knew they were close, but they couldn't find it, and they had almost no fuel left. Radio experts later said her behavior was strange. She didn't send enough updates, she waited too long between transmissions, her equipment was failing, and so was her energy. Her final words promised one more message. It never came. As news of her disappearance spread, President Roosevelt ordered a massive search. It became the most expensive air-sea search in U.S. history at the time. It cost $4 million, about $80 million today. 9 ships, 66 aircraft. The Navy scoured over 250,000 square miles of ocean. The battleship USS Colorado launched floatplanes. The carrier USS Lexington deployed over 60 planes. The Itasca even burned oil on the surface, trying to create smoke columns, but nothing helped. On a hot July afternoon in 1937, 15-year-old Betty Clank sat on the floor of her Florida home, spinning the dial on her family's radio. Around 3 p.m., she stopped. A woman's voice came through, trembling and desperate. "This is Amelia Earhart! This is Amelia Earhart!" it repeated. Betty froze. For the next 3 hours, she listened in shock. The woman on the radio was pleading for help, arguing with a man who sounded injured and confused. Sometimes they fought over the microphone. Sometimes the woman just cried out, terrified, as water rose around them. Betty grabbed a notebook she used for song lyrics and started writing everything down. The signal faded in and out. Minutes passed between messages. She stayed with it until 6:15 p.m., never knowing that she might be the last person to hear Amelia Earhart alive. Decades later, modern scientists would prove she hadn't imagined it. A research group called TIRE reanalyzed 120 radio signals reported in the days after Earhart vanished. With modern tools, computer models, signal simulations, and propagation maps, they found 57 of them were real. Not just noise. Not hoaxes. Real broadcasts from Amelia's plane. And they traced the signals to one place, Nikomaroro Island. It was about 350 miles southeast of her target, Howland Island. That changed everything. It meant Earhart didn't crash straight into the ocean. Her plane landed on land, still on its wheels, and stayed there for days. One radio station closest to the island reported a clear voice using the call sign, khaki, Earhart's own. The farther away the stations were, the weaker the voice, but the pattern held. Something was transmitting from Nikomaroro. But how did Betty, a teenager in Florida, hear it from 4,000 miles away? That's where it gets strange. Earhart's radio had two main frequencies, 3105 and 6210 kHz. But it also created harmonics, strong signals at multiplied frequencies, like echoes. Some of those harmonics landed right in the sweet spot for bouncing off the ionosphere. They skipped across the sky. Betty had a 60-foot wire antenna in her backyard, and it just happened to be tuned perfectly for those skip signals. So while no one meant for her to hear Amelia, physics made it happen. What Betty and others heard wasn't just static. It was a 6-day nightmare unfolding in real time. The first confirmed signal came in on July 2nd at 6:55 p.m. It was faint, but the Coast Guard logged it. Over the next few days, messages got clearer and more frightening. "Water's knee-deep," Betty wrote. "Let me out." In Canada, a woman heard, "We can't hold on much longer." Another message said, "Still alive? Better hurry. Tell husband all right." The tide became their enemy. When water flooded the engine, they couldn't transmit. So they waited for low tide, calling out each night for just a few hours. On July 5th, almost all the messages talked about water. The last known message came on July 9th, then silence. 3 years later in 1940, something else turned up. A British officer on Nikomaroro named Gerald Gallagher found a human skull under a tree. Nearby, he found more bones, a bottle, a woman's shoe, and an old sextant box. He sent the bones to Fiji, where a doctor said they belonged to a man. That closed the case, until 2018. A modern anthropologist, Richard Jantz, used new techniques to compare the old measurements to Earhart's body. He found that the bones were a better match for her than 99% of people in the global database. But the bones were gone. Only the notes remained. There was more. In 1991, a piece of aluminum was found on the island. It was 19 by 23 inches. And matched a patch on Earhart's plane that had replaced a rear window. Photos from Miami before she took off showed the patch clearly, the rivets, the dimensions, everything lined up. Other plane parts were also found, made from mid-1930s Lockheed materials. Some had heat damage but weren't melted, suggesting fire. These parts were taken by settlers for crafts, but they were once part of something bigger. Then came the personal items, a jar of freckle cream. Earhart had freckles and was self-conscious about them, melted glass used to boil water. Makeup pieces, a US-made jackknife taken apart for parts, a talon zipper made between 1933 and 1936. These were small things, but they told a big story. Someone, likely a woman, had lived there, struggled there, tried to survive. A photograph taken in late 1937 showed something strange. It was taken by a British officer visiting the island and showed the old wreck of a ship. But when enhanced decades later, a blurry shape in the water looked like aircraft landing gear. Analysts said it matched the Lockheed Electra's wheel assembly. Maybe it snapped during landing. Maybe the ocean finally dragged it away. In 2017, the world paused again. A photo surfaced from the U.S. National Archives. It showed two figures on a dock in the Marshall Islands, one possibly Earhart, the other Noonan. In the background, a ship towed what looked like an aircraft. Some believed this was proof they were captured by the Japanese. But experts quickly tore the theory apart. No Japanese soldiers were visible, no official record of her capture exists, and wartime chaos had erased many truths. The strangest theory claimed she lived under a new name, Irene Bolam, as a New Jersey banker. One man swore he saw her at a pilots' gathering in the 1960s. A book was written. Lawsuits followed. The real Irene Bolam proved who she was, complete with records, licenses, and photos. Still, the rumor never fully died. In 2024, hope sparked again. A former Air Force pilot, Tony Romeo, spent $11 million on a sonar scan of the Pacific Ocean floor. His team found something 100 miles from Howland Island, deep under the sea. The shape looked like a plane. But after a year of hype, the truth came out: it was just a rock. Romeo took it well. He made t-shirts that said, "We find rocks." And he kept searching. In early 2025, a new clue surfaced. A strange shape appeared in the lagoon at Nikumuro, seen in satellite images and drone footage. Researchers named it the Tyria object. It sat near a peninsula and matched theories about where the plane might have ended up. Dr. Richard Pettigrew, a top archaeologist, led a new expedition to find out more. His team was serious, scientific, and determined. The search was on again. Meanwhile, another team was chasing something even smaller: DNA. A scientist named Dong Yang began extracting DNA from old letters Earhart had sealed with saliva. If the DNA matched living relatives, it could confirm who touched items found on the island. They also tested bones and fragments from earlier digs, including a finger bone. This wasn't guesswork anymore. It was forensic science, real proof, real answers. After nearly 90 years, the evidence keeps pointing to one place. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan likely landed on Nakuro. They survived the crash. They sent out messages. They tried to stay alive. And they died there, alone, waiting for help that never came. Bones, bottles, buttons, and broadcasts tell the same story. Still, nothing is final.